Hey everyone, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome back to Gear Curiosities. On today's installment, we are once again revisiting the original Line 6 pod, though we're actually talking about the 2.0, although it appears I'm seemingly not holding that product in my hand. As you'll see soon enough, I kind of am. So we're actually talking about not necessarily the 2.0 in its physical form, but this little guy. This is a ROM, or read-only memory chip. And to really explain the significance of this and the significance of what we've done here with the pod, I think we need to start with a bit of a history lesson because the Line 6 pod original released back in '98, and a lot of early adopters rushed out to get it because it was the newest, coolest thing to be able to reasonably affordably have all these amp models and digital effects in one kind of box, if you want to call it that you can access on your desktop or play through a real amplifier, all that good stuff. But as most early adopters eventually learned, the newest, greatest thing is always out there on the horizon, and that especially applies when you buy the first generation of technology, whether it be an amp modeler or a new CPU architecture, a new cell phone. Generally, the next couple of revisions are based on the same general outline of the first product, but they're tweaked. They fix most, if not all, of the bugs or inconveniences of the prior products. They add some quality of life features, and that's pretty much what happened in the early 2000s with the Pod 2.0. And I think 2.0 is a bit of a misnomer at best. It's kind of misleading. It's not like comparing the Axe-Fx 2 to Axe-Fx 1, where although you could kind of get similar sounds, the 2 had so much more processing power. There was so much modeling capability that you simply could not do on the 1 or Ultra. And with the 2.0, it was really based on the 1.0, which is kind of supercharged and unlocked more or less. As I showed on a prior pedal head video, a lot of the features the 2.0 advertise as being superior to the original are actually accessible on the original itself. If you look at it, you'll think, well, there's no way to change cabinets. There's nothing labeled for that. I've only got 16 amp models. But if you load up the correct software and plug a MIDI cable in, you'll see that you actually have access to another dozen or so amp models. You can change the cab model independent of the amp, so you can have a 2x12 with your rectifier or a 4x10 with your Marshall if you want. You can tweak all sorts of effects parameters that you otherwise couldn't, but those things aren't accessible from the front of the device, which is where the 2.0 does have an edge. Along with those accessibility and quality of life features, the 2.0 also added a few new amp models of its own, bringing the total up to 32 amps on board. It changed slightly the functionality of the air mode switch, and as you would expect from firmware updates on something like a Kemper Profile or Axe-Fx unit, it also made tweaks to the amp modeling algorithms, supposedly making them more accurate as well as overall sounding better. Of course, we'll put all those claims to the test and compare them to, the original hardware as it shipped in at least the 1.4 firmware, since that's what I have. So the real question becomes, how the hell do you turn a 1.0 into a 2.0? Now you have to remember, this was quite some time before our founded practice of firmware updates over USB was really standardized. I mean, nowadays you can just get the newest update on your cell phone wirelessly, and then with other like digital guitar gear, you plug in a USB cable and you're done. Not so back then. This does not have a USB port, and that Ethernet RJ45 jack is for a foot controller, so you can't just plug it into your computer and get the update that way. There's also no real hardware inside to overwrite the current firmware that's on there. So what you buy is seemingly what you're stuck with. But Line 6 heard all the cries and the demands of the original owners of the pod, and since the 2.0 is basically a glorified firmware update, then they decided, what if we just sold the firmware update alone? And that's exactly what they did for some time at least. So this is the last firmware chip that I pulled out of this. This is a ROM, read-only memory. This is kind of akin to the modern solid-state flash storage you might find in something like a flash drive or even a mobile phone. And it's kind of like the memory modules on RAM DIMMs that you'd find in your computer, except in that case, that's RAM, random access memory, and it's volatile, meaning that it's constantly getting read and then rewritten and then dumped. And when you turn off your computer, it's completely gone forever, because if you don't have a constant charge, current voltage driving that memory, then it doesn't actually save anything. But with ROM, read-only memory, you can kind of think of it as a solid-state hard drive that you can't write over, at least without specialized equipment. And since ROMs have been manufactured for literally decades at this point, for all kinds of consumer electronics, from calculators to video game cartridges, it makes pretty good sense they would use this to house their firmware. So if you wanted to update your original Line 6 pod in, say, the year 2002, it basically goes something like this. You get on Line 6's website, or an authorized dealer, and you wait the 3 to 5 minutes it takes to load that web page because you're on a crappy like 256K modem like I was at the time, and you finally get that sorted, you order it, and then it takes like a week or two to get there because this was pre-Amazon Prime days. So then you finally get your little $30 to $50 chip in. I have no idea what they were actually charging for this at the time. But knowing that they're probably counting on uneducated consumers, they, guarantee you they charge a lot more for this than they should have. But they, the consumer gets the chip in, and then this is where stuff starts to get kind of comical from today's point of view. You remove the 4 screws that you can see kind of in the little peepholes there, take that off, and then take off the back cover, and you're presented with the bare PCB of the Line 6 pod. You can see all the pots, you can see the ICs, you can see the processors, and that's just kind of like in today's world of all these manufacturers putting warranty voided if removed stickers, which isn't legal. It's not enforceable in the US, so quit doing that stupid shit, everyone. Manufacturers threatening all this warranty crap if you literally take off a screw. It's pretty funny that the sanctioned, advertised way to update firmware, something that we take for granted as being so simple now, you literally disassemble your product and they trust you to do that. And to be fair, it is a super simple process. You just, plop out the old chip, you throw in the new one, make sure you don't bend any pins. It's like a big fat RAM slot you'd see on a modern computer motherboard, and then you bolt it back together, turn it on, and you can hold one of these buttons to make sure the firmware is correct, and you're ready to roll. That's pretty much it. Of course, compared to our modern just download and update and don't touch it until it's done, a little more complex. But overall, I still think it was a good move by Line 6 to allow themselves to fix some of their mistakes from the 1.0 and to give early adopters a second chance at having the newest, greatest thing without having to break the bank on basically the same identical product with a few tweaks. So the first thing I wanted to test is see just how much better the firmware sounds. And we are rocking 2.3. That is the latest one. It's done, it's discontinued, it's obsolete. So that's the last sound firmware you can get out of this device. There's an equivalent on the Pro that's supposed to sound the same. And basically what we're going to do is I'm going to reamp a dry DI through this on some identical presets that I made on the 1.4 firmware. We're going to compare them, see if the amp effects or cab quality significantly change in any way, and see what we can pick out before we start looking into some of the newer features. let's talk about those results from least significance to most significance, at least in the way that I perceive them. So the first thing that was apparent was cab modeling doesn't appear to have changed all that much, at least with the air mode set at the same position and with the same cab impulse or whatever model they're using. If it sounded square and boxy before, it's going to sound square and boxy now on the newest firmware. There's really no major difference in EQ or how it sits in the mix. So that's kind of an okay thing if you had something dialed in before. If you like, you can transfer it to the new firmware and it sounds just as normal. I won't say good, but it sounds pretty much the same. But that was a bit disappointing to me because I was hoping at least there'd be some tweaks to make it sound more authentic in the direct application. The effects quality doesn't seem to have changed either. I don't perceive any higher resolution or super sampling or really any changes at all to any of the algorithms. They sound as good as they did before, and they sounded pretty damn good before in the 1.4 firmware. And I don't think they would, increase the, computational overhead of any of those algorithms, considering they're probably, gridlocked in terms of processing power on a 1.0. So anything they could have done with the actual 2.0 product, they're probably being held back by legacy stuff unless they trim some fat on other algorithms and modeling stuff, but I just don't see that happening. So as far as I can tell, the effects quality is stock from 1.0, which is fine because they sounded good enough. What I did start hearing some changes in, though, were the high gain amp models. So the best way I can describe it is that the attack and the immediate decay of a lot of these high gain amps, like say the rectifier, specifically rectifier number 1 is probably my favorite high gain amp model on this. It's as if you're getting this very brunt, square wave type boxy attack. It sounds like you're playing a distortion pedal through a 1x8 solid state amp. That's the same kind of honk that you get out of that. And then, kind of immediately transitions into something that sounds more authentic, but it's that artificial digital signature that I think a lot of people don't like about older digital gear. With the newer update, though, it goes from this focused, honky attack to something that has a little bit more bite, a little more articulation, and then immediately smooths out in a way that sounds more like a tube. I'm not going to say this thing sounds like a tube amp, but it is much more close, that little subtle change. The EQ of the amp doesn't, sound really all that much different. The dynamics, the presence in the, high or low end in terms of how it's resonating with the cabinet, but that little attack difference, I think, really probably comes down to some modeling tweaks in how their virtual tubes behave, and it is more accurate. It does sound better. Not only does this make the built-in drive boost and distortions that much more usable to get something, resembling a real high gain sound, it also makes driving the front end with outboard gear like a Tube Screamer or Clean Boost that much more authentic sounding. It actually reacts a little more how you would expect. So that was a pleasant surprise for me, and it does sound more authentic. I'm not going to say authentic, but more authentic. And you kind of hear similar improvements on all the amp models in terms of accuracy with what I think is their tube modeling engine, and just overall smoother, more pleasing to the ear sound quality. Of course, I didn't A/B test all of them, but I can say that even stuff like the British high gain classic models and the USA models that you can access now via the front panel are much improved, I think, from the last one. And it's one of those weird things where, it's a subtle difference. At the same time, it's also not even as big of a difference as something you'd get off of like a modern AXFX 3 firmware update. Although, perceptively, this might sound more significant, it's probably like 1/10 of the code difference, or maybe 100th of the difference compared to, a lot of the changes we see on Kempers and AXFX and Helix and all that nowadays. So again, one of those results of 80 for 20, we're getting into territory now where it's exponentially more work to get it to sound more realistic. Now that we have some idea of the sound quality difference between firmwares, let's check out the new control scheme with the 2.0. Now, I'm at a disadvantage with this because the 2.0 actually marks all the secondary controls, and I'll show you on screen now what they actually are. As a result, I had to reference that picture basically the entire time I was playing with this, and I got a few of them memorized now. But still, even with the 2.0, not a lot of it is particularly engaging or makes a whole lot of sense, like why a lot of the delay controls are on middle and treble, and like some of the stuff like the drive boost and channel volume boost, like that kind of makes sense, but a lot of it simply doesn't. So not to mention that a lot of the stuff just isn't labeled all that well. For instance, you can change the cabinet model now by holding down tap tempo and changing these. At least on the 2.0, you can see that you're in 4x12 territory, but it still doesn't tell you what it is. It doesn't tell you that's a Marshall with a V30 or that's a Greenback mic with an off-axis SM57. You just kind of have to hear it and say, oh, well, I guess that works for what I'm using. So I'm going to show you kind of what it does, and basically everything revolves around the tap tempo, which on the 2.0 says hold in parentheses, and that's how you access the different amp models. Other than what's shown here, that's how you access the cab models, that's how you tweak delay parameters, effects, all that good stuff, activate the drive boost, and basically now 95% of the features that you can do over MIDI are now available from the front panel. My feelings on this increased control functionality are kind of mixed. On the one hand, I appreciate basically all the variables being accessible from the front now, especially if you're a bedroom player or you just like me and didn't want to hook it up over MIDI for demonstrating some of this stuff, or you're jamming with the band and rehearsing and you don't have to spend, several hours the day before setting up patches and presets and then getting there and then saying, oh shit, that actually doesn't work. Now I have to go back and deep dive into those parameters again. You don't have to do that. Now everything you can just walk over and say, oh, well, I actually do need that treble boost. I'll hold down tap and turn it on there. Or I actually don't need a drive boost. I can get it there. And that's good. And you can save it and, access your preset again. The one thing I'm not huge on is just how much time it takes now. With, the original firmware, it was like, that's all you got. Everything you see is what you get. So you may not get the absolute best sound, but you get it quicker. And, you throw on, say, the rectifier model, dial up your tone stack kind of the way you would expect, and you're basically done with your rhythm sound. Now, you have these more options to play with. And in some ways, I think it's a good balance where it's still kind of idiot proof, where even if you don't know what stuff's doing, it won't let you go too far, too badly. And I do like being able to change the cab model, even though I didn't think I would care about that too much. And all of that just kind of takes away from what made the 1.0 so charming to me to begin with it being just turn a couple knobs and you've got a complete sound. I still think this is a pretty decent compromise in terms of functionality and simplicity. It's just now everything pulls double duty, which isn't terrible, especially if it was labeled. But that is one major drawback to just installing a firmware update on a 1.0. You don't have all that as reference, and eventually I guess you'll memorize it, but it does make it a little bit more of a pain in the ass. And you got to question, if you're going to do it this way, what's really the difference between having something that does 2 effects instead of 1 versus having a dedicated potentiometer or say an encoder that does anything, depending on what screen you're on, like a Helix or even a Pod XT X3 HD did. And that was a tongue twister, actually. But yeah, I mean, in some ways it's cool, and I appreciate being able to change stuff like the cab model on the fly now, but again, it does make it a little less attractive because of that. So with all that said, the thing I was really interested about this upgrade was less of the sound quality, less of the even the functionality on the front. It was more so of this whole air mode switch. On my initial test drive of the 1.0, I found that disabling cab modeling by using the amp mode really didn't work anywhere. It all sounded kind of shit, actually. Tried it with a third-party impulse response to see if we could save it in the direct mode. Not really, kind of didn't work too well there. Put it through a solid-state stereo power amp, through a decent real guitar speaker cabinet. Sounded pretty flat, kind of like a toy, with just a little bit of the top-end sparkle and definition coming from a good cabinet. And then we put it in the effects loop of a tube power amp, of a real amp head, through a 4x12, and comparing it to the real preamp channel also sounded like a wet muffled blanket, and it's just not good. And after reading up a little bit more about it and seeing the changes they implemented in the 2.0 and 2.3 firmware, it's obvious why. I don't know how I missed this very crucial sentence in the manual, but apparently the amp mode wasn't necessarily all that intended for plugging in an effects loop, which you would think it would be, considering you have, everything built in here that does your tone stuff, but it's actually meant to plug into the front of an amp. And I gotta tell you, Line 6, that is just fucking stupid. I mean, I know I'm probably not talking to the same people that were there. I'm pretty sure a lot of the talent that had a hand in creating the original Pod series is no longer there. They got pulled by the parent companies and all that stuff. But you advertise this thing as a stereo, all-encompassing guitar processor. So the only way that you can use this thing, at least the 1.0, without going over MIDI, which who the hell really wants to do that if you're playing with a real amp? The only ways you can use it is in front of an amp, which is now mono, which makes no sense because even a lot of clean channels, some of them just don't take reverbs and choruses and delays well in front. But what makes this thing sound so good in the effects section is that it's stereo. And basically what happens when you flip that amp switch is that at least on the 1.0 firmware, not only did it disable many parts of the cab modeling that makes it at least a little more dynamic and fleshed out sounding, it also throws kind of that wet blanket EQ curve over top of it to be more compatible with something like the front of a clean amp. So it's really no wonder it sounded terrible. Now on the 2.0, there's an interesting little thing with this. So when you switch to amp, you actually don't necessarily disable the cab modeling, which is weird. Don't like that. I think it still should be disabled by default. And you can hear it even on the amp switch. If you plug it into a stereo effects loop and you switch cab models, you can hear the sound change. But what happens if you keep it on amp and in bypass mode, it kind of sounds like the 1.0. It's not great. It's still that flat, kind of flubby, not too inspiring sound. The magic happens when you flip it back to direct and disable cab modeling. And this is basically how you should always use this thing. I don't know why the air mode switch even is there now, because this thing sounds like shit with it off completely. So what this really should be is, are you using it with headphones or are you putting it through a PA? Keep it here. You want, our cab models. Are you using it through an actual guitar speaker cabinet? Put it over here. That's what it should do. It doesn't. So that's a really bad, not well explained feature at all. And even the manual doesn't explain it that well, because it took like 2 or 3 times of me reading it over the past month of clicking, thinking, oh, that's what it's for. So in this test, you're going to hear the direct enabled and cabinets disabled. This is how you should use this thing with a stereo power amp. Now we're cooking. That's more of the sound that I was sort of expecting from the 1.0 to begin with. And this is like the worst case scenario, putting it through the effects loop of a budget solid state combo amp through, the bottom of the barrel speakers that they could find for this thing, mic'd up with single dynamic mics for each side. So it can only get better from here. And I think that's a fairly realistic use case, that if someone were to spend $300 to $400 on a modeling device like this, they might use it through something in that price range of another $300 to $500 to even $600 that's stereo capable. Because if you're buying this, you're unlikely to be using tubes to begin with, or else you just use the damn tubes and get a couple more pedals to finish out your sound. And I almost put this through the effects loop of one of my tube heads and then through a 4x12 just to see how good it would sound and if it can keep up. But as I was dragging microphones out and plugging stuff in, moving equipment around, I thought to myself, this is actually kind of stupid, because if you own one of these, not only are you not likely to own a decent half stack, at least back then, but you're damn sure probably not going to tour with both of them or gig with both of them, because if you like the sounds out of the half stack, then just, use that, I guess. But, a lot of the people that were touring with the XT Pro or even the original Pod Pro 10, 12, 15 years ago weren't necessarily using it because it was their best piece of gear. A lot of them had, the sort of tube heads and, boutique pedals and all the stuff to get their on album tones. But even if they were using the XT Pro or the Pod Pro, it was going through other decent outboard equipment, or they were using it because it's just convenient. There's no maintenance on something like this. You don't have to change tubes. You ain't got to worry about it really blowing up. You can stick another backup in another 2U rack space. And guys like John Brown, he used an XT Pro for a while through a stereo EL34 Marshall power amp through a real cabinet, and that brought some, liveliness and some warmth to an otherwise all digital thing. But you basically put an entire rig in the space that a tube head would take in a rack unit. So it makes sense in that way. But when it comes to the more budget-friendly beans, which are more slated towards desktop recording and the occasional amp playthroughs, then it really doesn't matter how good it sounds through tube stuff, because you know, although this is your bottleneck, it's still not going to sound all that bad because of you're playing with other high quality pieces of gear. So it's just kind of a use case that doesn't make sense. However, I thought we'd take one more academic exercise and see if this direct modeling helped anything with the cabinet impulse response compatibility that we saw last time, or the lack thereof. So in this test, we'll be using a high quality own hammer impulse response that I use, you know, a lot on modeling hardware. We're going to throw that directly after this, as well as some VST power amp emulation, just to throw in a little bit more of that tube coloration that I wanted. And then we're going to tone match, or EQ match, the difference between the onboard cabinet I used and the impulse response, and see just how much color is baked into the cab modeling on this thing. Boy, this test is pretty telling. So even taking the direct sound we were using through the power amp here that sounded pretty good, just throwing an IR after it sounded pretty bad. I mean, there's a lot of low end rumble, not a whole lot of definition. But once I tone matched it, or EQ matched it with the built-in cabinet, then we can kind of see what's going on. So in order to get it to sound similar, there's actually this huge shelf at 100 Hertz. I mean, enormous. So much so that you probably couldn't even do that on a lot of modelers. They'll limit you out before you hit the 24 to 30 decibels you're seeing here. And then there's a big scoop between 1000 and 2000 Hertz to get that metal sound that comes stock with the rectifier cabinet there. And then you get kind of another peak around 3000 to 4000 for some fake presence. And then just a huge shelf after that to add some artificial high end. And that's just one of those like dirty tricks, I guess, to make it sound like it's more lively than it actually is, but it's really not. And you don't need that sort of insane post-processing on modern amp models, because it's supposed to cover those sort of things. It's supposed to be doing all the push-pull and the resonance and all those, you know, features that are baked into tube amp design anyway. So you can literally just throw a cab IR after it and it sounds like the real deal. So that was a pretty eye-opening test for me personally, and kind of proves the old stigma with original pod tech and even like the XT, is that if you're going to use outboard cabinet models, or even the stock ones, be prepared to EQ this thing to holy hell if you're going to use it on recording. It's the only way you're going to get something that sounds semi-authentic, which is unfortunate, because I think with just, you know, some of this tweaking, a few of these fixes really would have sounded fine and more authentic. But it's unfortunate that the way that it's set up, it simply doesn't play well in direct applications at the same time as something like this. So that pretty much brings us to my conclusions. Is the 2.0 worth it over the 1.0? After playing through this, I would say yeah, probably. Playing through a stereo power amp sounds so much better. Being able to independently turn off the cabinet modeling from the front. You could probably get something very similar through MIDI on 1.0, but that kind of defeats the purpose if you're using it with a real amplifier anyway. Not to mention that the 2.0 hardware includes a lot of those labels and stuff that I'm missing, so you'll actually know where the 4x12 cab models are, where the drive boost is, all that good stuff, without having to reference a picture the entire time, which is good for these sort of physical playing environments. So that begs the question though, is the ROM upgrade worth it for 1.0 owners? At the time, probably was. I mean, I could see a significant difference in the way I used it and the way it sounded. So that's, you know, kind of cool. It's unfortunate that it wasn't just a free upgrade anyway, but it's one of those modern things that we're spoiled to now with current generation amp modelers. But right now, I mean, if you plan to seriously use a 1.0 anyway, maybe, but I don't know who would be. And they don't sell them anymore. You can't go to line6.com and buy this. It just doesn't exist. They're discontinued. The way I got mine was from an eBay seller called Vintage Synth Parts out of Italy, and the guy makes ROMs for, you know, synths and classic hardware like this, which is super cool. And at least in my experience, the price was negotiable, which is very nice. So I got mine for like 22, 25 bucks US, which is probably worth less than that to me. But you know, I'll be able to use this in a couple content pieces, so it's all right. But it's one of those things where you can't make it because you have to have specialized hardware to burn ROMs, which is going to cost you a lot more than just buying that single piece off the internet. So that made more sense to do that. But yeah, in 2019, doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, except if you plan on using the 1.0 anyway, and it's like your daily driver for a low volume practice rig. That's kind of it. This is more of a scholarly exercise, and partially I bought that so I would have the final version of the original PodTech. That way in the future, if and when I do shoot this out with the final versions of all the new PodTech or newer, then it'll be kind of a fair fight. You know, the 2.0 latest firmware versus the X3 latest firmware versus the HD latest firmware or whatever. So that's another reason I ended up grabbing it, but pretty cool. Can't say go out and buy it by any stretch of the imagination, but now this thing is fairly usable. And though I was using this as a practice rig with this amp before, it kind of had those problems that I wasn't really impressed with. Now I have no problem plugging in this thing just to play, just to get away from everything else I do in terms of music writing and the channel. If I just want to play guitar, it actually works great. So pretty good upgrade for me personally. Can't say rush out and go buy you one though. It's a very niche market. So that'll about do it. Thanks for watching this episode of Gear Curiosities. Any questions, comments, as always, leave them down below, and we will see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.